had to be in Orlando, Florida this last week, which was sort of a weird trip because I flew down there. The hotel where we had this conference was in the actual airport itself. So I never really went outside the airport. And anyhow, airports are sort of neither here nor there. I called a friend of mine who's very astute, and I said, all right, I went to Orlando, and I never went out of the airport. Did I actually go to Florida? And she paused, and she thought, and she said, well, you were on Florida, but you were not in Florida. So yeah, I mean, that was the deal. But it was an interesting conference on being, well, the presidents of the theological schools here in the United States, and they wanted to hear from me on what it is to be a president and a scholar at the same time, and I talked about what I'm doing with you all. So, tonight we're going to talk about Paul and slavery. But before I get into the topic of Paul and slavery, remember, what we've looked at so far is basically kind of an introduction to Paul, but then Paul and women. We looked at Paul and his opponents. We looked at Paul and, what's the other one? There was something really interesting. They're all kind of intertwined with one another. That's the whole point. Now, the last week I left for you to decide the topic. So I want you to, before the evening is over, to let me know what the curriculum for the last week is supposed to be, all right? Otherwise, I'm going to show up here next week, and we're going to sort of stand here and look at one another. Because, you know, we can do that. All right, Paul and slavery. There's a couple of things I want to, it was Paul, and what did they have to say about sexual behavior? Paul and sexuality. That was the second night we were together. I've talked a little bit about slavery because, and it was really in connection with Paul and slavery, was it not? Because, remember, I used the language, or the analysis of Sarah Rudin, who thought that much of his position on human sexuality was specifically directed against the abuse of power that comes about when a master or a mistress uses the slave for his or her own sexual ends. So some of this is going to sound familiar because I'm going to do a little bit of a review, and part of this has to do with just Greco-Roman culture. That would be the culture out of which Paul, or out of which he grew up, but to which he addresses himself. What it had to say about slavery. This is a Roman fresco that shows, can you see who's the slave and who's the free person? Guy on the right is being served by the guy on the left. So very clearly, who's the slave? Yeah, the guy on the left. And the other way, of course, in Greco-Roman society, you could typically tell slaves from their dress was the slave wore a really short tunic. This is little better than a rag. And the master typically wore something that was at least mid-calf, if not all the way to the ankles. This was a class-conscious, even caste-conscious world. And in those worlds, differences between classes or castes were in fact enforced by what we call sumptuary legislation that decreed who could wear what. Okay? I think I remember telling you a couple of weeks ago that only members of the senatorial class could wear purple, right? That if you were found wearing purple and you weren't a member of the senatorial class, you could be fined or even punished. Sarah Rudin, whose work I've had occasion to mention to you before, thinks that about 25% of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. That's enormous. That's really, you think 1/4 of the population served, and it's not fair to say that 1/4 of the population served the other 3/4, because something like 8/10 of all slaves were owned by 1/10 of the population. Okay? So it was wealthy people who owned slaves. It was as simple as that. Slaves tended to be concentrated in the cities. And I'm going to talk about the demographic significance of that as well. But basically, one of the neuralgic fears of the Principate, anywhere from 200 years before the birth of Jesus to 200 years after the birth of Jesus, was this fear of a slave revolt. They had several what they called servile wars. And a servile war is one where the slaves rose up in revolution. You may have seen a movie called Spartacus at one point or the other. It's very romanticized, but it is based on a figure who led the Third Servile War, and he very nearly succeeded in establishing an independent slave republic. Okay? So it's a really kind of a fascinating glimpse into, you think that, kind of one of the lessons here is that if you try to enslave a quarter of the population, sooner or later they're going to rise and maybe even succeed. Okay? Now what Spartacus wanted was actually just, a separate piece, if you will. Just let us establish our own way of life. He was eventually, defeated in battle. He didn't intend to, take the masters and string them up or something like that. But, the truth is, this was an uneasy socio-political arrangement when a quarter of the population is enslaved. I've mentioned to you before also that worship, pagan worship at least, was strictly segregated. Now, it was segregated along gender lines, of course, so men and women typically did not worship together, but slave and free did not worship together either. Okay? And that meant then that a slave could feel disenfranchised on a number of different levels. Okay? Now, that's just kind of a general overview of slavery in the world in which Paul grew up. The life of a first century slave was really pretty tough. This is actually from North Africa. It's a bas-relief, as you can imagine. You note that this guy's got the long toga on. This one's got the short tunic on. Can you tell what this guy's doing? Yeah, he's punching him in the face. Okay? He's punishing him. Slaves, we know, did all the menial tasks. It was the stuff that you're familiar with. Frankly, that when you were growing up, you probably had to do in your own house. They washed the dishes, they cooked the food, all those kinds of things. Took out the trash. Any menial task a slave did. Though, interestingly, some of the tasks that today we would consider to be, strictly speaking, professional. Things like teaching, medicine, architecture, even being a chef. That was also done only by slaves. Okay? How many of you are in pre-med? Have hopes you're going to be a doctor one day? Well, in antiquity, that would have been slaves' work. Okay? I think probably today it is not. Okay? But it's always a good thing to remind yourself that 2,000 years ago, you would have been a slave, right? Anybody studying architecture? No? Okay. You got a good school of architecture here. I've done a couple of your grads over the years. Anybody planning on being a teacher? Oh, good. There's a couple of us here in the room. Slaves work. That's true even today. Stipulate that as well. Cooking. We have celebrity chefs these days, Who's the local guy? Who's Gerald Kraft, I think is his name, who gets all those awards. Gary, is that who he is? His name?
Gerald Kraft.
Yeah, it is Kraft?
Yeah, it's Kraft.
Yeah. He's very good. In antiquity, he would have been a slave. Okay? Now, slaves could be punished for the slightest infraction. And that's why I have this bas-relief here of the guy punching his slave. Here is a little epigram by a fellow by the name of Martial, who writes at more or less the same time that St. Paul does. Where was my Latin scholar here in the room? Is she here tonight? Oh, she's not here. She probably is tired of being called upon. Okay. Here's my little translation of Esse negas coctum leporum porcisque pragela maus rufe cocum scindere quan leporum. You say that the rabbit is not well cooked and ask for the whip. Gee, Rufus, you would rather carve up your chef than your rabbit. Okay? Now, Martial is in some respects upbraiding his friend Rufus. Okay? Mavis here, I translated it as G. It's a little stronger than G. It probably more something like Jesus Christ, except that, of course, he was a pagan and he wouldn't have done that, right? Okay? He's not calling upon the gods in the strict sense, but this is just kind of an expression of incredulity and faint disgust at the same time, which is why I decided to render it as G. But, you know, carving up your chef just because the rabbit is not cooked to your liking is pretty abusive. And Marshall calls Rufus out for that kind of thing. The fact that this epigram was, memorized, preserved, and ultimately published indicates that most people recognize the truth of the epigram. Okay? So what was the appeal of Christianity? And I'm going to kind of narrow down to Paul here in a second. But Christianity, of course, welcomed everybody. Slave and free, male and female, Jew and Greek. Can you tell, by the way, what this bas-relief is? Yeah, they're gladiators, exactly. Who were slaves. Now these folks were kind of the ancient equivalent of the NFL or the National Hockey League or something like that. I mean, they were athletes. In some respects, they were, rock stars, if you want to use that anachronistic terminology. People had their favorites, people would bet on their favorites and so forth and so on, but they were still slaves. Okay? So in that world, the fact that this group welcomed slaves and former slaves, freedmen and freedwomen, and gave them, so to speak, an honored place in the community was really absolutely unheard of. And I use the language of unique, but I mean it was so unusual that it attracted even the unfavorable attention of the Roman authorities.
Is that even weird for like the Jewish culture?
Jewish culture did segregate its worship by gender lines. So men and women typically did not. Jews were not big slave owners, okay? Even in Rome itself. One of the things that's really interesting about Judaism, and particularly in Rome, is that people admired it, okay? People admired Judaism because of the high quality of its moral life. The Ten Commandments, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't all that kind of stuff. That was admirable. It was not strange, the failure to refusal to eat pork or shellfish or any of these things would be staples in the Italian diet. They thought that was weird. Circumcision was even weirder than that. I mean, why would you slice off that part of your body, of all parts, It's not exactly like you're clipping your fingernails or something. So as a result, they were admired but kept at a distance. We'll put it that way. Okay. Anti-Semitism in our sense of the term, that we really date from probably the 17 or 1800s in Europe, and that flowered, at its sort of this murderous during the Third Reich, and unfortunately, as you know, just manifested itself at the graveyard over in University City. That would have been unknown in antiquity. There was a certain degree of, as I said, respect for Jews. The other thing is that Romans had an enormous bias in favor of antiquity, okay? And Judaism was an ancient religion. So that automatically gave it a certain legitimacy and cachet. But in Rome itself, Jews were not big slave owners, okay? Mostly because, when you read the Torah, the Torah again accepts the existence of slavery, but decrees that every 7 years slaves ought to be freed. Those kind of things. So it just tended to be not a widespread practice within the Jewish community. But here's the deal. Because Christian communities welcomed these slaves, it was thought perhaps to harbor certain revolutionary tendencies. This also is exacerbated by the fact that Christians tended to meet at night. And again, there's a big question among historians. Did they meet at night because so many of them were slaves and couldn't get away until, the master's or mistress's needs were taken care of? Or did they meet at night simply because, Jesus is buried and they tend to associate the resurrection with sunrise, so that every worship experience is basically like the Easter Vigil, and you wait for the sun to rise? Question around all that, okay? But that said, Christianity was enormously appealing to slaves. Now, we've got some conflicting evidence from Paul, okay? On the one hand, as we say here, he built a community, or strove to build a community, which welcomed men and women, slave and free, Jew and Greek. So that questions around ethnicity, questions around social location, questions around gender seem to have been irrelevant, and we have evidence for this both in terms of membership and leadership. And that's very important, okay? We know that there were women leaders. We talked about that when we talked about Paul and women, but we also know there were slaves who were leaders, okay? And as a result then, again, this is weird from the standards of the first century to have a community that would be mixed, but that the leader might also be a slave, okay? Slave or former slave, because there was as much prejudice against former slaves as there were slaves themselves. Now, but here's the other conflicting evidence. It's one thing to say slaves are welcome here, but at the same time, he also seemed to accept the legitimacy of slavery as a social institution. I decided to look up, I don't consult this thing very frequently because I don't really need to as a New Testament scholar, but I looked at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Because they list a series of things. This is, it's formulated under John Paul II, and then the man who eventually became Pope Benedict had a very strong role in, kind of articulating its outline. Joseph Ratzinger became Benedict. So it represents, relatively recent Catholic thinking, and they talk about what they refer to as exceptionalist moral norms. In other words, there are some things that simply are never permitted under any circumstances. Okay? Rape, for instance, can never be morally justified, right? And they mention slavery. That slavery is never morally justifiable, okay? I can't cite the chapter and verse from the Catechism of the Catholic Church for you because, frankly, I didn't look that hard. I knew where to look, and it was like, I thought, slavery was in there as one of the exceptions norms, and I saw it and was like, yeah, it is good. All my memory has not failed me completely, but you can look it up yourself, okay? I mean, you're students here and honing your research chops and all that kind of business. Now, how do we get from Paul accepting slavery as a social institution to John Paul and Benedict, and frankly, I think all of us here, thinking that slavery is something that can never be morally justified? Okay? Let's examine this. What did Paul actually have to say about specifically Christian slaves? This, as we'll see here, is from the first letter of the Corinthians. Everyone, he says, should remain in the state in which he or she was called. Were you a slave when called? Never mind. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For the one that was called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, the one who was free when called is a slave of Christ. And he's basically saying there's a kind of a moral equivalence in the eyes of God among all of us, whether we are slave or free. So if you're a slave in actuality or in real life, you're really free in Christ. But if you are free in real life, then you're a slave of Jesus. All right? It sounds very nice, but look at that first part here. Everyone should remain in the state in which he or she was called. And he's even here addressing the question if you're born pagan, you have yourself circumcised, and Paul would, of course, say, no, don't do that. But he's also saying here, if you're a slave, you should not attempt to have yourself freed unless maybe it's easy to do so. Now, why would he do that? Let's just sort of puzzle this out for a second. Given the fact that 25% of the population is enslaved, given the fact that there's a kind of neurologic anxiety, particularly in the city of Rome, but elsewhere too, around the possibility of slave revolt, given the fact that Christianity was already attracting unfavorable official attention regarding its admission to slaves both as members and as leaders, what do you think might have influenced Paul here.